Hello and welcome. My name is James Paul, and this is Jake Brady and I's Hamlet seminar on Shakespeare's deliberate inclusion of women in the play. William Shakespeare is a very recognized playwright. One of the reasons for this is his ability to use characters to highlight messages rather than strict dialogue. Shakespeare places women in a male dominated Denmark setting. Ophelia, the young innocent daughter of Polonius, and Gertrude, Hamlet's mother and the Queen of Denmark. Our thesis is in Hamlet, Shakespeare utilizes the characters of Ophelia and Gertrude to critique the patriarchal treatment of women by portraying them as powerless victims of societal and familial control, where their value is tied to purity and obedience and their relationships with men. In doing this, Shakespeare conveys the theme of misogyny, highlighting the devastating consequences of a society that silences and objectifies women. Our arguments in order are as follows. Firstly, how women portrayed as powerless victims of societal and familial control. I will prove this argument using Claudius and Polonius forcing Ophelia to use Hamlet's love for her to find out his source of madness. Secondly, how women's value as a person is completely tied to their purity. Jake will prove this argument using Laertes' formal warning that Ophelia only holds value while she is chaste. Lastly, how women's relationships with men in a male-dominant society give them value. I will prove this last argument using Gertrude quickly remarrying her late husband's brother while still mourning his death to keep her status as queen. We will prove these arguments using direct quotes from the play, as well as secondary sources about the play tied into our thesis. We will also make connections to other literatures and forms of modern media, for example, a song or TV series that share similar themes and prove the same message. Let's get into our first argument, how women are portrayed as powerless victims of societal and familial control. Jumping into Act 3, Scene 1. At this point in the play, Hamlet has been going mad for quite some time. Everyone is wondering why, but no one has the courage to ask. So, Claudius and Polonius devise a plan to manipulate Ophelia, using her and Hamlet's complicated love to uncover the source of his madness. The quote reads as follows: Ophelia, walk you here. Gracious, so please you, we will bestow ourselves. Read on this book. That show of such an exercise may color your loneliness. We're oft to blame in this. 'Tis too much proved, that with devotion's visage and pious action we do sugar o'er the devil himself. In this quote, after describing the plan to Ophelia, Polonius and Claudius assure her that although what she is doing is a sin, it is acceptable if done just once. This moment exemplifies Ophelia's powerlessness. She is forced into an action that is both morally wrong and potentially destructive to her relationship with Hamlet. She has no choice but to agree, further proving Shakespeare's use to highlight the devastating consequences of society that silences and objectifies them. Ophelia does not even speak out, demonstrating the extent of her subjugation. The men, fully aware of the ethical implications, ask without guilt, secure in the knowledge that Ophelia's societal position leaves her with no alternative but to obey. David Leverins' analysis further supports our argument, stating, her history is another instance of how someone can be driven mad by having her inner feelings misrepresented, not responded to, or acknowledged only through chastisement and repression. From her entrance on, Ophelia must continually respond to commands which imply distrust, even as they compel obedience. This reinforces how Ophelia's madness stems from a lifetime of forced submission, repression, and disregard for her autonomy. She is never given control over her own emotions or actions, existing only as an object to be controlled by the countless men in the play. Every command she receives is filled with wrongful intentions and manipulation, treating her less like a person and more like a pawn in the political games of Denmark. Similarly, Richard Finkelstein offers further insight into the systematic demolition of Ophelia's subjectivity, stating Laertes continues with his pressure, but she never tells him what he wants to hear, that she will consider Hamlet's interest transient at best. Her near silence and privacy challenge Polonius's economic arguments for restricting her behavior towards Hamlet. His energetic inquiry into the true nature concerning Hamlet's intentions displaces in politics the paternal invasiveness of his actions, his narcissistic attachment to Ophelia paradoxically shown by his disinvestment in her as a person. This analysis highlights how Ophelia is subjected to Polonius's control, yet she never actively resists. Her silence is a form of passive defiance, but it is ineffective against the overwhelming authority imposed on her. Polonius, despite his supposed concern for her well being, views her as nothing more than an object to be used for political advantage. His interest in Hamlet's intentions is not driven by genuine care for Ophelia, but by his own ambitions, further reducing her to just an object rather than an individual with her own desires.
Women's value as a person tied to their purity. Shakespeare portrays women as having their value tied to their purity to critique the devastating consequences of a society that silences and objectifies women in Hamlet. This theme is introduced in Act 1, Scene 3, as Laertes is speaking to his sister Ophelia before leaving to go off to school. He states, "Fear it, Ophelia, fear it, my dear sister, and keep you in the rear of your affection, out of the shot and danger of desire. The chastest maid is prodigal enough if she unmask her beauty to the moon. Virtue itself scapes not calumnious strokes." Here we see Laertes warning Ophelia about remaining chaste while he's gone. He implies that her worth in the eyes of a man is directly correlated to her chastity, and if she loses her virginity, she is no longer useful. During this time, women were seen as bargaining chips, and both Laertes and Ophelia's father Polonius want to use Ophelia's marriage as a means for trade for something in return. However, if she becomes impure, she is no longer useful, and she will be seen as having no value. By presenting such dialogue, Shakespeare shows how deeply rooted this idea of purity is within society. Laertes and Polonius are both aware of Ophelia's love for Hamlet, but choose to make decisions for her to further their own best interest. We also see the theme of women's worth being tied to their purity with Hamlet in Act 3, Scene 1, when he states, "If thou dost marry, I'll give thee this plague for thy dowry. Be thou as chaste as ice, as pure as snow, thou shalt not escape calumny. Get thee to a nunnery, farewell." Here, we see Hamlet's tirade against Ophelia as he takes the hyper-fixation on Ophelia's chastity to the extreme, stating that even if she were as chaste as ice, she would still be worthless in his eyes. He also commands her to go to a nunnery where she can take a vow of chastity. By framing her in terms of unattainable standards and condemning her regardless of her sexual standings, Hamlet demonstrates how society at the time defined women by their chastity. Further, in his paper on misogyny in Hamlet, Robert Brustein writes, claiming that he never loved Ophelia, exhorting her to breed no more sinners like himself. Hamlet urges her to enter a nunnery. Only in a cell sheltered against unchaste behavior can beauty be cloistered from corruption. We see that the belief of men at the time had horrific, dehumanizing views on women, specifically seeing them as useless if not chaste. Of course, this also had a negative impact on the state of Denmark as a whole. Authentic relationships between men and women could not be created, leading to distrust and dishonesty throughout the state, as well as an overall sense of moral decay. We can clearly see that Shakespeare's use of women's values being tied to their purity critiques the greater treatment of women in society, and leads to devastating consequences throughout the state of Denmark. Women's relationships with men in a male-dominant society.
Gertrude's role in the play similarly reinforces the theme of female subjugation. Though she navigates her situation differently, rather than being a passive victim like Ophelia, Gertrude maintains what little power she has by remarrying herself with Claudius. Her quick remarriage is not just an emotional betrayal of Hamlet, but a strategic move to retain her status and security in a patriarchal society. Claudius justifies their marriage by addressing the court. Together with remembrance of ourselves, therefore, our sometime sister, now our queen, thy imperial jointress to this warlike state, have we, as twere with a defeated joy, with an auspious and a dropping eye, with mirth in funeral and with dirge in marriage, in equal scale weighing delight and dole, taken to wife, nor have we herein barred your better wisdoms which have freely gone with this affair along. Here Claudius acknowledges that their marriage was one of necessity as much as desire. Gertrude, as queen, held her power only through marriage, and remarrying quickly allowed her to secure her place in the royal hierarchy. Shakespeare uses Gertrude to show how women in positions of influence were still limited in their autonomy. Her power was tied entirely to the men she was with, forcing her to make decisions that prioritized survival over personal desires. David Leverins further explores this argument, quoting, "The mixed and contradictory expectations of these father figures reflect their own divided images of dutiful reason and bestial lust. At times, their power seems to be defined by their ability to order women and children around. Hamlet sees Gertrude give way to Claudius, Ophelia give way to Polonius. Leverins' point supports the argument that Gertrude, like Ophelia, is ultimately controlled by the men around her. She may have more influence due to her royal position, but her actions are still dictated by societal expectations and the men in power. By giving in to Claudius, she maintains her role as queen, but at the cost of her independence and her relationship with her son Hamlet."
Connections to literature. To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. Although set in very different eras and focusing on different major issues, both Hamlet and To Kill a Mockingbird display societies dominated by men, where harsh limitations are faced on the female characters. We see this through male-dominated societies, a fixation on female reputation, and an overall lack of agency for women in both works. The setting of Macomb, Alabama, in the 1930s is very much a patriarchal one. Within the novel, we see that women aren't allowed to hold positions of power, including even serving on a jury. The voices of women in society are very much repressed, just as we see in Hamlet. In both works, women are held from power and reliant on men in almost all facets of their life. Queen Gertrude holds the highest amount of power of any woman in Hamlet, and she had to remarry her husband's brother right after her husband's death to keep it, with little time to mourn. This shows the little power women hold in both works, and the lengths they might go to maintain it. The character Scout is a great representation of the fixation on female reputation and purity seen in both works. Scout is a young girl who's more of a tomboy, dressing in more masculine clothing and acting in ways unusual for a young lady in 1930s Alabama. This is very much to the dismay of her aunt Alexandra, who insists she dress in skirts and acts more like a lady. This is comparable to Hamlet, where Ophelia is expected to remain pure and act like a lady, without being given any freedom to express herself and make her own choices. Lastly, we get a sense of a lack of agency from both women in both works. Whether it's the women of Macomb, Alabama, not being able to hold civil positions and contribute and represent their society, or Scout being forced to dress and act ladylike, not being able to express herself, or Ophelia having to obey her father and brother and not being allowed to follow her own desires and love who she wants to, we see that women are oppressed and mistreated. Ultimately, misogyny and the mistreatment of women is a negative consequence for both societies, and it leaves a huge portion of their society unrepresented and oppressed, leading to tension and mistrust. Both of these works reveal the importance of the empowerment of women in society, critiquing misogynistic views that have been prevalent for hundreds of years. The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. The Great Gatsby, set in 1920s New York City, also deals with many of the issues involving misogyny and the treatment of women. We see this mainly through the controlling of women's agency in both books. In The Great Gatsby, we see the treatment of Daisy as merely an end and not as a mean. She is used as Gatsby's sole ambition, which is dehumanizing as it treats her as a mere object. Similarly, Tom views Daisy and Myrtle as objects, not for who they are. The women in the novel are shaped by the men in their lives. Tom's inherited wealth and Gatsby's fortune control every aspect of Daisy's life, showing that men control the society. Similarly, in Hamlet, the control of Ophelia and Gertrude can be compared to this. Their entire lives are centered around their relationships with men, whether that being Ophelia's love for Hamlet or Gertrude's remarriage to remain in power. Both women lack any agency in their life, relying solely on men, which proves devastating for their society. Overall, both works illustrate a critique on the themes of misogyny and how a lack of agency and control given to a woman in her life can ultimately have devastating consequences. Both works critique our broader society, calling for equality between genders and a realignment of how our societies function. To be successful, everyone needs a voice and control over their own lives, which is a lesson we can pull from both works. Connections to modern media. Forrest Gump. Forrest Gump is one of the most famous movies of all time, and while not everyone looks to it as being a work that deals with women's issues, there are many examples of misogyny and the mistreatment of women that can be compared to Hamlet. Primarily, both works deal with the objectification of women, as well as an overall lack of agency through the characters Jenny and Ophelia. Throughout Jenny's life, she is often in abusive relationships, a stark opposite from the love and respect that Forrest shows to her. In her childhood, she is abused by her father and eventually taken away from his custody. In college, we see her with an abusive boyfriend, and after graduation, we see her in many other abusive relationships, struggling to get through life. Jenny is objectified and used for her attractiveness, while being abused and dehumanized. This can especially be seen in the music performing scene, when Jenny is laughed off a stage while performing a song naked, trying to do whatever she can to make some money. On the contrast, we see Forrest have a somewhat simple and wholesome path through life, highlighting the struggles and setbacks that women face compared to men during the time. Jenny is never really faced with a real choice, instead being pushed around by men in her life, showing how society has taken all the control out of her life. Similarly, in Hamlet, we see Ophelia used as an object when Laertes and Polonius force her to remain chaste. They want Ophelia to be used as a trade piece and not an actual human. They show no love to her and control every aspect of her life, eventually driving her mad. We see how both works critique the devastating consequences that controlling one's life can have, and they give a call to promote equality in society.
The themes of female subjugations and pressure against women to conform in Hamlet resonate strongly with hit music artist Beyonce's song, Pretty Hurts. The lyrics go, "Mama said, you're a pretty girl. What's in your head, it doesn't matter. Brush your hair, fix your teeth. What you wear, that's all that matters." Now, I might not have Beyonce's voice, but it is clear to see that the lyrics above or on the screen mirror the limitations Shakespeare has given to the women in the play. Just as Ophelia is used as an object and Gertrude is expected to maintain her role through marriage, the song critiques a society that values women primarily for their appearance and their ability to conform to male-defined roles. Furthermore, the lyrics, "Pretty hurts, we shine the light on whatever's worst," align with the suffering both women endure as they try to navigate a world that refuses to see their true worth. Shakespeare and Beyonce both expose the emotional and psychological cost of these expectations, emphasizing how women are left feeling powerless and unfulfilled in societies that prioritize their purity and obedience.
Concluding remarks. Throughout Hamlet, Shakespeare uses the two characters of Ophelia and Gertrude to critique the patriarchal treatment of women by portraying them as powerless victims of societal and familial control, where their value is tied to purity and obedience and their relationships with men. In doing this, Shakespeare conveys the theme of misogyny, highlighting the devastating consequences of a society that silences and objectifies women. Although written over 400 years ago, we can still pull the theme of misogyny out of this work of literature, comparing and contrasting it to modern works, as well as applying it and using it as a lens for our own society today. Today, women still face major setbacks and limitations strictly because of their gender. They aren't subject to the same opportunity as men and have unfair beauty standard and etiquette standards placed on them that men do not have simply because of their gender. We can use Shakespeare's use of women in Hamlet to reflect on how the women in our own society are treated and change the way we think and treat women in our own lives. Ophelia and Gertrude represent a call to action for gender equality in society, and we must do everything we can to level the playing field. Thanks for watching.